Tell me. Hi.
Hi. We should chat briefly before everybody arrives at the party.
Yeah, tell me everything. Should I have sent you my PowerPoint, or is it okay just to have it on my computer?
Yeah, no, I'm going to make you co-host now, so you just share it.
Okay.
which is fine. Yeah. We are looking forward to your performance.
I'm excited to be here. I've been teaching for 5 hours, and so I am broken.
Oh my goodness.
I know.
Wow. Wow. You know, I have to teach for a whole hour every week. So, I mean, I'm crushed.
How do you do it?
Well, I do record lectures, but, you know,
Good.
it's not too bad. Great. Okay. Well, this will be good. We normally get going 1 or 2 minutes after the hour, as you know. And good. Great.
Okay, and this seems pretty easy. Hopefully I don't.
Perfect. Yeah. And I think, you know, half an hour is fine. There's no great urgency for you to be less than that.
Yeah, I did it today and it was like 28 minutes.
Perfect.
28,
Yeah.
30,
No,
20,
there's no rush. It's good.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for doing this, Sam.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. How are you doing otherwise?
Good. No, yeah, things are fine. I'd love to get into a position where I'm just working in the morning and just gardening and playing in the afternoon. That's my dream. That's my dream world. But right now we're, you know, homeschooling 3 kids as well. So.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. But no, things are going fine. And, you know, Princeton is a pretty easy life, so it's okay.
It sure is. It's known for that.
Yeah. It's a little too easy. The comfort level is just destroying all my energy levels for anything else. All right. Okay. I'm going to hide out and then I'll start in a second.
Sounds good.
Okay, welcome to QPW number 17. Hopefully you can all hear me. A quick check. Yes, there's a check. Well done. So my name is Andy Reynolds. I'm convening the Queer Politics webinar, as many of you have joined us in the past. Today we are going to have a terrific presentation and discussion from Sam Ritholtz from the University of Oxford, who I'll introduce in a second. We just, if you're new with us this week, normally take about half an hour's worth of presentation. And then the second half of the hour will be comments and questions and discussion. If you would like to pose a question or have a comment during the discussion section, please send me a chat message or communicate somehow that you want to be on the list. You don't have to tell me your exact question, just tell me that you would like to be on the list and I shall add you to the list for the second half of the session. One day I'll work out how to do the raised hand function, but even my 6-year-old hasn't shown me how to do that yet. As I said, we are very excited to have Sam Ritholtz with us today, who is doing their doctoral degree at the University of Oxford in the Department of International Development. Sam is actually originally from America, from New York, has a BA from Cornell and a MSc in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies from the University of Oxford. So is now making the United Kingdom his home and occupying it while I'm not there. We pride ourselves on, I think, breaking binaries and shattering some of the preconceived notions of academic research. And I see today's presentation very much in that genre, in the sense of thinking about migration and forced migration and displacement, not in purely bounded by nation states and passports. I think Sam's going to talk very interestingly about how we can conceive of the movement of LGBTQ people as a type of migration. We are going to start with Sam's presentation. If everybody is ready, we'll get underway and I'll hand it over to Sam for his presentation, Conceptualizing US LGBTQI Representation, Urban Migration and Displacement. Off you go, Sam.
Thank you so much, Andy, for such a wonderful introduction. Can someone just give me a thumbs up so that you can hear me? Okay, great. I am terrified of online platforms, but this is wonderful. So no need to introduce myself, as Andy just did a wonderful job. I'm super excited to be here today. So thank you so much. I was telling Andy beforehand, I had 5 hours of teaching today. And so if my voice just gives out in the middle of this, I will be doing the rest of the presentation. I'll just type it all in the chat box. So with that, let's begin. This paper that I'm presenting, it is a paper. It's gonna hopefully come out in the next year or so in a forthcoming journal article. But I'm also hoping to expand this into a broader book project. And the paper itself, and Andy set me up with the perfect introduction. It's very much a provocation. I want it to be challenging. I want to be challenged. I can't wait to hear your feedback. And I want to start a conversation about what I view as a bias in how we conceptualize displacement and a disservice to a lot of LGBTIQ people in the United States, but I think this also applies to the United Kingdom, just I don't use the statistics, but also in a lot of other particularly developed countries. And so with that said, I want to just warn everyone that there will be some academic jargon, especially in the beginning of the presentation. I will explain it, so don't feel worried. Don't feel the need to be Googling anything. If I haven't explained something properly, you can always ask me at the end, but the logic of the presentation goes that when academic jargon comes up, if I don't explain it that slide, I explain it the next. So I understand that it's not just an academic crowd, and I want everyone to understand me. Except I can't change slides. Okay, now I can. Great. So I want to start out with an actual two paragraphs that a friend of mine, Dana, wrote to his local newspaper, which was the Tribune in Georgian. which is a two-person newsroom, as it says in the title up there, serving Camden County, Georgia since 1894. Dana wrote this letter in 2018 when I was actually doing my master's degree, and he posted it on Facebook, and that's where I came across it. And it was a letter to the editor in regards to a bill that was put forward by the Georgia State Legislature, Georgia the country for the record, excuse me, Georgia the state, not the country, which was putting forward a proposal to ban same-sex adoption. Dana wrote, "I didn't come out in high school because it was easier to deaden and bury a part of myself than it was to have my fears of rejection and isolation confirmed. Today, when I see Camden County's elected representative advancing legislation that would codify discrimination against LGBTQ people into Georgian law, it makes me feel that it's probably right to doubt whether Camden County would accept me. But I'm not hiding any longer. There's a special kind of grief that grows in between loving your home and knowing that you are not really welcome or accepted or wanted there. Camden County gave me a breathtaking foundation to thrive in so many ways. I've worked hard and hope to do Camden proud, but in moments like this, it does not feel like Camden is proud of who I am and will always be." And so this is basically the crux of the prompt of this presentation, is that Dana's story elucidates the struggles and sadness at the intersection of forced migration, queer transmigration, and politics. Living now in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, Dana details elsewhere in his letter that though he would like to return to his hometown to raise children, he can't. But Dana is lucky. He is college-educated, white, and has had the resources and privileges to leave Camden and make a life elsewhere in the United States. With not enough visible harm to gain the attention of the humanitarian community or forced migration scholars, Dana's migration presents an interesting tension. Cut off from his community and facing discrimination, Dana left home. But can his departure be considered forced migration? And so this produces two research questions. The first question, is there an epistemological heteronormativity present in the study of forced migration? Basically, is there a bias against LGBTQIQ subjects in the study of forced migration? And if so, how does challenging this bias or challenging this epistemological heteronormativity change our conception of displacement? And so to start, I want to actually point out the why behind this question. Why does this matter? And to do that, I want to conceptualize displacement itself. And my argument for why this is a very cogent and very urgent topic is that displacement is actually a conceptual tool used to legitimize suffering. The scholar B.S. Chimney, summarizing another scholar, Roger Zetter, classifies that legal categories are not merely devices for exclusion, but also of exclusion. Another scholar, Matt Gibney, labels forced migration as an evaluative inclusive term, a vague and inclusive concept, embraced in a large measure because it enables scholars and practitioners to break free from the shackles imposed by the legal category of refugee. The value of forced migration as a concept has always been in its open-endedness. So I view displacement as an extension of forced migration, that to forcibly migrate means to be displaced. And what that means when we acknowledge a migration as forced or we acknowledge a migration as displacement is that this is something that is unethical, amoral, or immoral, excuse me, or worthy of humanitarian aid or intervention. And so, though in academia, I will say that this idea of like, is migration voluntary or is it forced? A lot of that is, they're saying that's a binary that doesn't have to exist. It's on a continuum. There still is a very loaded sense of what displacement means and what it calls for. And so looking at the literature and the discipline of forced migration, there's a lot of scholars who have talked about what makes up a forced migrant or who gets deemed a forced migrant. Polzer and Bakewell are two scholars that point a lot about how who becomes a forced migrant is often deemed by government bureaucrats, academics, general society, or those with the most obvious and visible cases. And what they argue is that those who eschew easy categorization often end up invisible. And so what happens here is if there's a migration that's happening that's if it's hard to see, if it's at the margins of society, the scholars of forced migration studies might miss them. And B.S. Chimney also argues that the concept of forced migration has been reconfigured primarily to reflect the geopolitical and strategic concerns of Western states. And there's also a post-colonial lens here of who gets to be deemed a forced migrant and how does that reinforce common conceptions and prejudices at the state level, but also the international level. And then Anna Weary argues that there's a humanitarian logic, a particular ethos of compassion that predominantly focuses on exceptional figures worthy of attention. attention, which in the case of the discipline is people in situations of extreme and visible precariousness. And regarding these situations, Gibney would extend it further and say that only when the coercive forces are deemed illegitimate or unjustifiable are they considered forced migrants. And so he argues that if you look at deportation is perhaps the most obvious form of forced migration. You're physically being removed from a country. But because many don't question the illegitimacy of such a practice, it's not deemed as forced migration. When I did this project, and when I started doing the research in 2017 and 2018, at the time there was actually, I looked at the Journal of Refugee Studies. I did a quick search. It's not heavy statistical analysis by any means, but I did a search to see whether the word queer comes up. And this could be a sign of the times. I recognize to a lot of communities and a lot of people, queer is an uncomfortable term, but it is a term that exists a lot in academia related to queer theory and queer subjects. I wanted to see if it showed up. And in 2017, it didn't show up. I did it actually last week when I was prepping for this presentation, and there's been 10 articles since 2017 that include the word queer. All of these articles are about LGBTIQ refugees, so people who cross borders is the formal definition of refugees, so not internally displaced persons. And what that shows to me is that the global refugee regime does accept LGBTIQ people. It does include them to a certain extent. A lot of states will give refugee status based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Not every state, and it's not required by law, international law, but certain states, whether it's because of the courts or because of their own practice, have been accepting LGBTIQ refugees since the 90s.
Sam, quick note, our closed captioners are struggling to keep up with the speed of your brain. So
I'm so sorry.
Slightly slower so our captioners can get it. Sorry.
Yes, sorry.
That's right.
It was missing from my introduction that I'm from New York, and so I speak very quickly. I will slow down. So my point in bringing this up is to say that my argument is going to be that the field scholars and the broader society are missing a very unobvious form of displacement, which is the LGBTIQ internal migrants. But to make that case, I'm arguing that the field itself is not answering the right questions. And so that's where the term queer epistemology comes in. Epistemology is the study of the limits of knowledge, or the study of knowledge itself, or knowledge production. And since Marxism really and critical theory that came afterwards, so in late 1800s and early 1900s, scholars have been commenting that there's a subjectivity that we don't acknowledge in how we prove truth. That what we say is scholarship, what we say is worthy of scholarly critique, actually has real impacts in the world around us. And so in the late 80s and the early 1990s, feminist scholars started saying that there's a bias against women in a lot of social science and science in general, and that they're not asking the right questions that reveal and take into consideration the lives of women. And so these feminist epistemologies undertook something called standpoint theory, which comes from Marxist theory and critical theory, which is this idea that what you view as truth, what you view as your experience is very much subjective. It's based on what your lived experience is. And so if in scholarly inquiry, we take the perspective of someone who's not deemed the norm, there will be new insights. And so queer epistemology is making that attempt. It's looking to say, in our theory of knowledge, in looking at disciplines, how is it that certain aspects of the lives of LGBTIQ people are effaced? And so these conversations of epistemology and the impacts of it have had dividends. And so epistemic ignorance, epistemic injustice, epistemic violence, all of these different theoretical approaches are commentaries on what happens when people are left out of inquiry, of scholarly inquiry. And all of them make normative claims of worthiness. And so all this to say is that the work produced by scholars of refugee and forced migration studies has a normative impact on who becomes a subject worthy of investigation and intervention. And so if that was completely over your head, or you just want a nice quote to summarize it better than I did, I love this quote from Zazia Hartman, who's another literary theorist at Columbia, who says, For decades, I had been obsessed with anonymous figures, and much of my intellectual labor devoted to reconstructing the experience of the unknown and retrieving minor lives from oblivion. It was a way of redressing the violence of history, crafting a love letter to all those who had been harmed, and without my fully being aware of it, reckoning with the inevitable disappearance that awaited me. And so this is to say again that what happens when something is not worthy of scholarly inquiry is that it gets moved to the margins and it gets overlooked. And so this is the other aspect of this. So to rectify this, to fix this, I take what is called a queer phenomenological approach, which, to put it in less academic jargon, is just to say what it means to make things queer. Sarah Ahmed has an amazing quote that says, "To make things queer is certainly to disturb the order of things." And Judith Butler comments that queer is a site of collective contestation, the point of departure for a set of historical reflections and futural imaginings. And so this is to say, well, what happens when we take a queer lens? What does it mean to center LGBTIQ experiences? And I argue that for the purposes of this project, there's three things that are of interest to me. One is what Eve Sedgwick calls the epistemology of the closet. And the epistemology of the closet is basically this argument that says, well, what does it mean to live a life where you can reveal your identity? You don't always have the luxury of doing so, but lots of LGBTIQ people can reveal or can pass or can remain in the closet. Many can't. But what does it mean when you constantly have to come out, as your identity constantly have to come out? And what does it mean to be LGBTIQ versus other identities where you constantly have to come out? And so in epistemology of the closet, Eve Sedgwick compares Jewish identity and gay identity, both identities that for sometimes you can't hide it, but many times you can. And what she does in working through what it means, what's the difference between coming out as Jewish or coming out as gay, is key points of the importance of making things queer. And that's these next 2 points. The first is that gay people often, not always, but often don't come from gay families. And so they are born into a community that isn't necessarily their own. And what that means is that for many LGBTIQ people, the family can be their first site of violence, or it can be the first locus of discrimination they experience. The second aspect is that if someone comes out as Jewish or if someone comes out as gay, there's a difference in intersubjectivity. And so the story that she tells is actually the story of Purim, which I'm not going to get into. But if I were to come out, let's say, to my mother as gay, my mother would, well, if I was to come out as Jewish to my mother would be like, well, I know that already, I'm your mother. But let's say she didn't know that. Let's say I converted. She would say, okay, you're Jewish. And she could have her feelings about me being Jewish. She could have different things, but that's really where our interaction ends. When I came out, or if I were to come out, as I did, so my mother is gay, there's a series of questions that would probably subconscious questions that roll through the mind of my mother. The questions include, well, what do I think about gayness? Do I support him? What happens if I support him? If people think I support him and support having a gay son, does that mean that they'll think me amoral? Will they think me unreligious, not righteous? Will they think that I might be gay? And so that way that LGBTIQ identity, the way that it can impact two people and that can produce the result or can impact their relationship is a uniqueness to sexual orientation and gender identity. The third thing, which I've already commented on, but Kenji Yoshino talks a lot about, is how do you theorize and work with the closet? What does it mean that a lot of people can pass and can protect themselves but suffer in silence? And this is something that happens that I think is really important for LGBTIQ people in cities, is that what could be a flight, as Dana describes, it could be a flight from their hometown because of prejudice and discrimination, could be legitimized or publicly disclosed as, oh, I moved to the city for a job or for economic opportunity. And how does a discipline and how does a whole society conceptualize and work through those differences? And so to put this all together and to give you an example, I'm not going to go to the video because I'm afraid of the technology, but this was something that in August 2014 was posted online. Daniel Ashley Pierce was kicked out of his home for being gay. To show the popularity, has 220,000 views on YouTube, and this is the actual interaction that happens. And so the interaction is Daniel's grandmother saying, Daniel, I want to tell you before I say anything else that I love you. Now I know that you're not going to believe that it's true. And I won't read the whole thing, but this is an interaction where she's essentially kicking him out. And he's trying to defend himself. I mean, if you're reading the script here, he's saying, it's not a choice. She's saying it is a choice. And then she says, since you've chosen that path, we will not support you any longer. You'll need to move out and find wherever you can to live and do what you want to do, because I will not let people believe that I condone what you do. And this, I think, points to all of this. Daniel came out, and so Daniel was kicked out. Daniel's grandmother was afraid what other people would think if she let him be out and at home. And his family was one of the first sites of discrimination, or was the locus of violence that had him displaced, or had him forcibly removed or coercively removed from his home. Oh no. Okay. And so now to get to what the title of the presentation was, but this is just the final case study really, as I make this argument, is, well, with all of this theory, with all of this approach, what does it mean? Oh, and how can we even apply it? How can it impact our real life? And so what I do, and what I will present on, is I'll take the most extreme situation. And the most extreme situation is LGBTIQ youth experiencing homelessness in the USA. On the left are 3 different organizations in the US that support LGBTIQ homelessness, or youth experiencing homelessness. 2 of them are shelters, 1 of them supports shelters. I worked for many years with Casa Ruby. They're in Washington, DC. They're amazing. I know that they're really struggling right now with the pandemic and everything because they can't afford to close, obviously. And so if any of you feel particularly generous or in a position to help, these are some great organizations. That's my pitch. But this is to say, so to start with applying this approach, what I wanted to start with is, well, let's talk about how people publicly conceptualize queer migration in the United States. And so this is something that is very much existing in American narratives. There's this phenomenon of sexual gender minorities, internal migration from homophobic to safe areas in the US. And it's well documented. It's on every season of RuPaul's Drag Race, really. And there's also an estimation that 80% of queer/trans people in America live in cities. This migration is often reduced to a rural-urban story, the young queer trans ingenue ready to take on the big city. Kath Weston has an amazing article where she describes this and writes an ethnography of it called "Get Thee to a Big City," which I just had to include because it's such a fabulous title. And there's also been challenges to this. I mean, Gorman Murray and there are other cited scholars really reject this construction of rural barbarity. And it is to say that there are 20%, supposedly, of LGBTIQ people in rural areas, could be less, could be more, but there are people who are making their lives and living in rural areas, and so it's not fair to say that the whole rural area is barbaric. But when you look at queer trans youth experiencing homelessness in the US, there is an interesting phenomenon here. And I know normally there's people from the Williams Institute who attend these calls, and I recognize that there was a much more recent paper that I will refer people to, but then, so the numbers might be a little different, but the point remains the same, which is that LGBTIQ people youth are disproportionately represented in youth experiencing homelessness in the United States. They're about 7% of the US population, it's an estimation. I mean, I've seen anything from like 3 to 11% of the US youth identify as LGBTIQ, but they're over 40% of the youth experiencing homelessness. And also a disproportionate number of them are youth of color. When interviewed in one study, 46% of these youth say that LGBTIQ youth say they ran away because of family rejection of their sexual orientation or gender identity. 43% were forced out by their parents, and 32% faced physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Now, there are 4,000 shelter beds for youth in urban areas in America, and only 350 of them are specifically for LGBTIQ youth. And so if 1.6 million young people are experiencing homelessness, it's easy to conjecture that there's obviously not enough shelter beds for any of them, let alone the ones that are are LGBTIQ. Now, this is all talking about those that are visible, but there's an unknowable number of hidden homelessness. And hidden homelessness is those who either are sleeping on friends' couches, are engaging in different activities in the formal economy, including sex work, to have a place to stay for the night. And all of these people are not countable. And so this number could be even bigger. But at the same time, what is also known about this population is that because they're experiencing homelessness, public spaces are all the more important for them. And so in my hometown of New York, Christopher Street Pier is a prominent congregating point for LGBTIQ youth experiencing homelessness. But knowing that there's a public congregating point means that there's also the specter of hyper-policing, that these groups are constantly underwatched. Their association with the informal economy, informal practices means that they're often hyper-policed and they're just sometimes even just their presence is, it seems as if it's criminalized. And so, even though it's not formally criminalized. And so, and there's also racial elements to this. But this is to say that these people, these youth are super overwatched, they're super overpoliced, and there's other scholars that comment on this. And then if they get written up for any type of infraction, if it's a felony charge, then it's gonna impact whether they can get a job. And what that will further do is further marginalize them. It will make access to permanent housing even harder. And so in thinking through their predicament and thinking through the situation, I'm not going to answer 4 of these questions, but I want these in the back of your mind when I present my analysis. And that is these 4 simple questions. Was there coercion? So when these youth when they ended up experiencing homelessness, what got them there? Was their coercion legitimate? Could it be deemed that there was persecution? And do we think the state response was adequate? These are my 3 main points about this, and these are the heart of my argument. The first is that the private realm and the aspect of violence that occurs in domestic life makes this violence extraordinarily difficult to see. And as a result, it's difficult addressing more invisible forms of coercion, such as intrafamilial persecution. And so to go to the Polzer and Bakewell first comment, like, this is really hard to see. And if we can't see it, we can't really diagnose it, or we can't conceptualize it as something worthy of intervention, or having a moral claim to intervention or support. This poor legibility results or creates depoliticization. And so what I'm saying here is that if we don't recognize these people, these youth, as experiencing of persecution discrimination that causes their displacement, then what we're saying is that we could say they're suffering, but they're not worthy of any type of piqued interest, or there's no state responsibility. And so what I want to do is to say that I want to challenge our conception of persecution and challenge the idea of state responsibility. Just as a state has, as we say internationally, the US says states have, I mean, this administration is obviously a different conversation, but international law says states have responsibility to accept refugees, and states that experience displaced persons internally become subjects of conversations at the international level. This conversation should be happening here. And because it's not happening, because there's this lack of accountability, where there's no one, we're not really seeing it, there's no one to blame. As a result, there's this lack of accountability leads to a diffusion of blame. And so what we're saying here is that, well, it's an unfortunate situation, but what can we do? Who's responsible? And so the subtext of that is that these youth, this is their own burden because they came out. And so we're almost pathologizing their displacement and normalizing their suffering. And so what I'm pointing out here and what I'm trying to elaborate on is this American contradiction. Growing support for the queer/trans community affirms their right to a life free of persecution, but many of these youth are displaced from their homes because they are queer or trans. And so these 3 main points that I want to make salient, I want to repeat myself and push back our thoughts on, is that the violence queer/trans people have all experienced, coupled with the neglect of the state to protect, encourages them to either stay in the closet or relocate. By not combating this persecution or ameliorating the suffering, state authorities are condoning this phenomenon, even if they're not driving it. With no discourse that challenges this displacement, an illegitimate and coercive system is reinforced. Now, if this were an academic, if I were just doing this to an academic crowd, I'd finish here and say, let's discuss. But I know that there are advocates and there's activists and there's brilliant policymakers as part of this group. And so I actually want to provide an example of, well, what does it mean if we can reconceptualize this? What could reconceptualization look like? And here's a really easy example, actually, because it's already happening. Through a federal aid program, New York City, along with other major cities in the United States, already provides housing to people living with HIV. Now, this is part of a program that came out of the US effort to prevent the transmission of HIV. But this is a conversation that should be had in questions of homelessness. I mean, a lot of advocates will tell you housing is HIV prevention and HIV prevention is housing, because what these things do is they create risky sexual behavior that might lead to increased chance of infection. And so my question is, why doesn't New York City provide housing resources before these youth get HIV? Why deny proper preventative aid to our most vulnerable? HIV, like homelessness, disproportionately impacts LGBTQ people of color. And so as the United States is having the hard conversation on how to reimagine policing and community support and resources, there's an opportunity for change here. Instead of being reactive, we could be proactive. And so this is really just to say that with these dense arguments, that there are very lived experiences that could be impacted. And so I'm hoping that, sure, I think a lot of this people might have strong reactions to, and I'm super interested to hear, but I hope at the very least it gets us all thinking and we can start to have a really productive conversation that hopefully gets bigger. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sam. So let me make a call for questions, for comments, for discussion. Send me a chat message if you want to be on the list. I'm going to start with a question that you briefly addressed, Sam, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more. And I think what you've done is made a very persuasive case that the displacement of LGBTQ people in the US, but globally, is very much resonant and reflective of forced migration around the world. Now, categorizing it as forced migration, do you see it primarily as a reason of practicality of the solutions that could be triggered, the public policy implications that could be triggered if you call it forced migration? Or is it more a question of principle? It's a question of ethos, of philosophy. To what extent do you just see this as a way of getting better outcomes and addressing the problem? Or do you see it as a broader question of identification of a problem that is part of the philosophy of how we run and consider societies? Because one could imagine that you could have an argument saying, well, there are better ways of addressing this than calling it forced migration, if it was just about practicalities, right? But if it is about philosophy, then how does it fit into a broader global worldview? Do you see what I'm saying, to elaborate on that?
Yeah. Did I mute myself? No, right? No, I'm not muted.
No, you're not muted.
So I think that's a great question. And I think my first response is I don't have an answer that is yes or no, or either those two binaries, excuse me. But I actually do think that the answer is kind of both, but more towards the latter of philosophy. And so I think there's a very obvious policy relevance to this project. I think that there are people who are vulnerable, who are persecuted because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, that are worthy of more preventative care, more preventative aid. And part of when I first presented this project, a lot of comparisons I got was to Isabel Wilkerson's work on reframing the Great Migration of Black Americans or African Americans from the American South to urban areas as not a migration of economic opportunity, but a migration fleeing state and intercommunal violence. And so there's a policy relevance, of course, but there's a stronger, I think, philosophical conversation or scholarly conversation specific to the field of displacement, of the field of forced migration studies, which is to say that there are forms of migration, there are forms of coercion, which the scholars don't necessarily recognize. But if we did recognize them, if we did pay closer attention, I think what we would find is not only that we're missing obvious forms of displacement, but we're also that this could be applied in different settings. And so it's almost both, is that because there isn't a normative and evaluative effort as a result of scholars of refugee studies. I mean, the Refugee Studies Center at Oxford has all these policy briefings and things like that. So there is a normative element to the work the scholars do. But there's something to say that this type of argument could be reconceptualized and in conversations of domestic violence, or in conversations of state failure to prevent generalized societal violence against women or against other populations. And so I think I don't want to say I prefer one or the other, but I think both of these two aspects of the project really resonate for me.
Great, terrific. Let us take Francisco Fernandez Romero.
Hi, thanks, and thanks, Sam, for your talk. It was really interesting. I wanted to ask, at the beginning of the talk, you said that the way that forced migration is defined can respond to state interests at a geopolitical level, if I understood correctly. So on the one hand, the way you define forced migration says something about who is worthy, but it also says something about the context, about at the level of the state. So I wanted to ask if there might be issues of, for instance, homo-nationalism. So for instance, one country might believe itself to be especially good with respect to LGBT issues, and it might want to say, okay, we will take people from other countries because we're better at them on LGBTIQ rights, but they might not want to say, okay, they might not want to recognize internally that there are also issues and that some people might not feel welcome where they are within the country and might want to go to another place within the same country.
Yes, it's a great question. It's a great point. So Satvinder Juss is a scholar that I love, Juss is his last name, who talks about this, who says that because the international global refugee regime, the apparatus that accepts refugees and the legal instruments, because they didn't actually formally say LGBTIQ people deserve refugee status or deserve protection, but what has happened is a lot of states have ad hocly just accepted them and incorporated them as a new interpretation of the original statute or the original convention on the rights of refugees. As a result of that, it's kind of this new form of neocolonialism where it's the barbaric not West versus the West. And so they're already, and he's saying that unless there's laws or rules implemented that specifically codify these types of protections, it's just a new form of homonationalism. It's just a new form of saying, well, let's reinforce the other. Let's reinforce states that are not able to protect their own. But I do want to say that for this project, as opposed to saying, I don't want this project to come across as if I'm saying, let's accept more LGBT refugees. I think it's a whole different question. What I want this project to come across and say is that when thinking through the lives of LGBTIQ displaced persons or people who are experiencing displacement, I want to think through how are we actually conceptualizing their coercion? How are we actually conceptualizing their displacement? And I use this extreme example of LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness in the US, but this applies to crossing borders as well. I mean, when LGBTQIQ people come to a border, they come to a state that accepts refugees, let's say it's Norway, and then they have to make their claim, the Norwegian resettlement officer understands their displacement in a certain way. It asks for certain key measures of displacement. But if the displacement agent isn't necessarily the state, but it's your family, well, are they conceptualizing that? Are they accounting for it? And so that's where I think the nexus of this argument is. It's not to say, let's change the global refugee regime. It's to say, let's really challenge what we think of as displacement and coercive action.
Okay, good. Let's take Brian Oosthuizen.
That was a great pronunciation of my surname. I was not expecting that.
I spent too long in South Africa. Don't worry. I know my Oosthuizen.
Hey Sam, I feel like my question is more basic than the ones that have come before, but my own work is hopefully going to kind of almost build off of your own reconceptualization of the similarities between internal migrants and transnational LGBTQ refugees. But I know that in doing that, kind of have a tendency to maybe oversimplify the similarities between those two groups in this kind of queer utopia mindset of like, we're all the same and our experiences of displacement look quite similar. But I was wondering whether maybe you could talk a little bit about, if we take your argument that there shouldn't be as distinct a difference between these two groups, internal and transnational or international, what are some of the kind of key differences that remain between those groups of people, and perhaps in terms of lived experiences that you think we should be really key to cling on to?
It's a great question. And I think that the short and easy answer is that I think there's different logics of humanitarianism at play. And that's where I think my interest would be. And so earlier on, I cited the work of Anna Weary, who worked on Didier Fasson's approach to conceptions of suffering, which is to say that when migration or coercion happens in a certain setting, it's not picked up by the international community. And so a lot of times I focus on internally displacement in the US because I'm focusing it's obviously I care about the context, and I'm seeing this dynamic happen. But what I'm also pointing out is that from the get-go, there's already bias against this consideration because the US is considered the global north. It's a refugee hosting, accepts countries, well, it used to, hopefully it will again. But all those things, all those logics and assumptions come up. And I wanna say, even in this most extreme situation of the country that's the wealthiest in the world type stuff, like look at what's happening here and look at what we're not talking about. But whether like the actual importance of like, to that argument about like internally displaced versus at the border, I mean, I have another paper coming out that looks at, that isn't about internal displaced persons, it's about the border and what happens when like LGBT families are broken up at borders and how the regime doesn't accept it because it doesn't conceptualize queer concept, it doesn't include queer conceptions of kinship. And so I think this argument could be framed broader out. And so I don't want you to think like I'm making this bifurcation. It's very important. It's just that, and for this case study, almost, I was choosing a very extreme example to try and crystallize the most cogent points.
Good. Christopher Velasco.
Hi, Sam. Thank you for the presentation. I just had a couple questions, or mainly just one big one. Relating to your data, I know you used some quotations, and I was mainly just wondering if you could elaborate more on the data you use within this project. Like, is it archival in terms of looking at how different countries, for example, you just referenced refugees, like how countries process refugees? Was it more, for example, like interviews with LGBTIQ youth? I was just curious if you talk more about like sort of like the data, the methods behind this research project.
Yeah, of course. And so this research project it's strictly theoretical. And so what it was I was everything that I was as a quote is in the public domain. And the paper itself is actually much more in a conversation with like scholars of epistemology, queer theory. It's a very theoretical paper. So the quotes are all quotes that were LGBTIQ, like, I don't know if I included any, well, the quotes that are included were all done with public interviews. Or a lot of the numbers or things like that were coming from other reports. And so I used the Williams Institute report, I think from 2012, on LGBTIQ youth homelessness, but they updated it in 2019, which I did a cursory look for, and I saw that there was, the numbers are different, but the disproportionate nature of LGBTIQ youth experiencing homelessness is still quite high. So it doesn't change the arguments at all, but yeah.
Still taking names for the list. So if anybody wants to send me a quick message and add your list, a name to the list for comments or questions. Let me take another question. Let me pose another question to you, Sam. And this in part builds on what Christopher just said. And I know that your work here is not rooted in a sort of quantitative assessment of the degree of migration or movement of people from rural areas to urban areas. But what would you say to the challenge that there seems to be a pattern of that obvious channel from the countryside to the city being disrupted over the last few years in established Western states like the US and the UK, in the sense that people seem to be more staying in the rural areas if they're queer than fleeing to the cities. And some of the real enclaves of cities, you know, your Castro, your West Hollywood, your Soho in London, are becoming less gay concentrated. In many ways, a lot of the queer people have been forced out of those places because of economic reasons. And so that obvious young gay kid flees to the big city may not be a narrative story that it is quite as obvious as it was in the 70s and 80s and even 90s. So what does that do to your argument? What does that do to your analysis if that type of obvious displacement from the countryside to the city is not quite as obvious as it used to be? Does it injure your argument at all, or does it just mean you have to reframe it?
I think it's more a question of reframing, because one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking was that I posed that not to say that this is the truth, this is what's happening, but just to say like this construction or this association already exists in American society. And true or not, the question is, well, what happens if we reframe it? And so the first thing is looking at the reframing, is to looking at these dynamics more. And I mean, as I was saying with the Isabel Wilkerson thing, the Great Migration was over 100 years ago, but she wrote that book in the past 20 years because it's still of scholarly value and I think policy relevance to reconsider these types of questions so we could better understand what displacement looks like and tacit forms of coercion. The other thing I was thinking was that I think there's the rural to urban concept of this, I think could be reframed, because I imagine a lot of LGBTIQ youth experiencing homelessness in cities might be from cities as well. It's not to say that they're just coming from the rural areas. I mean, that's a narrative that a lot of care providers are offering, but it could be that they're from the same city. And I mean, I think if you look at, like, this is a ridiculous example, but like the show Pose, when you look at the narratives between the different actors, or the characters rather, like some are from the city and some aren't. And I think that's, so I think like that the rural urban, there is a very high proportion of LGBTIQ people in cities, but I wonder, like, how germane is it to the actual point of looking at more subtle forms of coercion?
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, I think what you're looking at is the forced movement of people out of their communities, right? And that community could sort of pretty much be anywhere physically, but people are forced to flee the kin that they are surrounded by. And so you're looking at a very explicit forced migration of people from one communal space to another, losing a lot of their kin. And so that's very reminiscent of internally displaced peoples around the world because of conflict or, you know, other communal issues. Which leads me to a question about, is there any precedence? And again, there's no real reason why you would have done this survey, but is there any precedence in international law to try and conceptualize the rights of people based on internal migration in this way, that could then lead to state benefits or state protections? So I'm thinking of like the Roma in Central Europe, or I'm thinking of any community, religious communities that may be forced to be internally displaced. Then they garner certain rights around them. Whether you could sort of, if you were appearing before an international law court, whether you could make a case that these people warrant international protections because they're reminiscent of other people who've been given protections in the past.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't really know the answer. I mean, I know there are certain communities that do get protections for, I don't know, because displacement's hard if it's like, especially pastoral communities, I would say, is like, it's hard to say that's not displacement, they're just pastoral. One of the things I was thinking of is that one of my dissertations actually about the LGBTIQ violence during the Colombian Civil War. And in Colombia for a long time, the only way the state formally recognized victims of the Civil War was through displacement. And so if you look at the data of all the ways of victims, like the victimizing acts or what they experienced that caused them to in need of state support is displacement. Then it's like disproportionately the number. And I think the number of people displaced in Colombia still as a result of this internal armed conflict is in the millions. So there is something to be said that, like, that is almost a similar phenomenon, not in the sense of of course there are LGBTIQ internally displaced in Colombia as a result of the conflict, of threats, of things of that nature. But the interesting thing is, like, well, what happens when the state recognizes this displacement? What happens when the state says, okay, we recognize that you were forcibly removed from your home, and thus you have a moral claim for support. And again, as I was saying before, is like, the US government already does that. If it didn't do that, then it wouldn't be providing a federal funded program to give people who have HIV housing. And so there already is precedent within the context of the United States of recognizing very specific forms of whether it's suffering or worthiness of state support. And so I think that claim could be extended, and I think it's interesting.
Right, absolutely. And actually, Thiago just posted in the chat saying how some indigenous claims on rights, indigenous peoples' claims on rights in Brazil and in Latin America sort of reflect this idea about protecting displacement of peoples within the nation state when, you know, that's the only way you're really going to ensure. Let us take Cordelia Bristol's question, and then I have another one I'll read.
So first off, I would love to say I loved your reimagining of this problem. And I wanted to take it a step further, thinking about, obviously in America, we're one country, but the lived experience, I would say, might be of different countries depending on what state you're in. And depending on how we go politically and legally the next, I don't know, 5-10 years, depending on what happens at the Supreme Court, if we divert back to more of a states' rights, states' determination, does this example potentially give more credence in the fact that there may be more of a state violence issue than there has been before as we've garnered more federal rights?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. When I was writing this paper, I was thinking, I was writing this right Trump's first year. And so I guess part of why I pivoted towards this context was this guilt of being an American who left. But I was going to graduate school, so I think I have an excuse, but not that I need one. But I remember people talking about Obama riding in on his rainbow, which was this concept of when a state was acting out of line, that the federal government would come in and protect the LGBTIQ individual. And so it's something to think about. I mean, this is a federalist state, has even more questions of, well, if the federal government has these protections and the state can't hold them, like what happens when people move states? I mean, it's a really interesting and meaty American question. And I mean, I do basically theoretical work with some qualitative interview type stuff, but like I would love to work with a surveyor or someone who does surveys to see like opinions. And I think there's a lot of different ways that this question could be further explored.
Wonderful. I'm going to read a comment from Dara Strolovich, who is unable to get on the chat right now. And this is sort of similar to some of the other things that we've said. And I think actually nicely expresses the importance of your project, Sam, which is, Dara says, this is very generative in part because it seems like part of your intervention is to try to do the important work of articulating and framing what is often treated as an individualized problem that can be resolved through a social services counseling approach. But it needs to be treated as a collective one, so one that justifies a policy response and the use of state resources. So in essence, what I'm reading from Dara's intervention there is that the importance of this is that a lot of our work has been band-aid responses in an individual level to the consequences of this forced migration. But unless you conceptualize it as a broader states-wide problem, you're never actually going to bring the resources to bear to actually solve the problem. It becomes, you know, something that is just individuals, not a collective issue. And of course, many people opposed to LGBTQ rights are going to want to see it as an individual, non-collective issue. The collectivists are the ones who actually see it as something that is part of the fabric of society, needs to be accepted as an equal right. Wonderful. If there are no other, in the final couple of minutes, questions, thank you so much, Sam. I want to thank everybody for being on the call today, and thank you for that terrific presentation and giving us a lot to think through. I do want to highlight, we have a little change in focus next week, which I hope many of you will be interested in. Next week, we have Dmitry Tolkachev, who is from the Moscow Higher School of Economics in Russia. He is going to speak broadly to the issues of being queer in Russia today, issues of law and issues of society. And to my knowledge, Dmitry is one of the few academics working on LGBTQ issues and one of the few gay people working on LGBTQ issues within Russia today. And so if any of you would like to pass on the announcement about his appearance in our seminar next week, that may be of interest to others engaged with the politics of Central Europe, with Russia, but also LGBTQ rights overseas. So thank you all. Thank you, Sam, for that. And everybody be safe and well for the week. and we will see you next Thursday as we prepare ourselves for the election in a few weeks' time. And so thank you once again, Sam. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.